We talk the talk, but are we actually walking the walk? Let's dive into how Jesus wants his followers to live by unpacking the Sermon on the Mount today on the Immuna 806 podcast, where real faith partners with real actions for the real world. So, getting right into it, I really like the Sermon on the Mount for a lot of different reasons. Not only does it give us a really clear picture of Jesus' heart for the people he is ministering to, but it also establishes what I think is a pivotal blueprint for Christian living and really a blueprint for how we should live regardless of where we are at in our faith journey, whether that journey is deep and rich or maybe even non existent. I think that the Sermon on the Mount exemplifies how we can all live fulfilling and rich lives, as well as addresses a ton of different concerns and facets of what goes on in many people's day to day lives. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. As a disclaimer, I am going to be providing a Spark Notes style summary of the Sermon on the Mount. So I would encourage you to read through Matthew chapters 5 through 7 yourself and really see what God is calling you to interpret and act out in your own lives today. Starting off the Sermon on the Mount, I think God really wants to establish some parameters for his people by giving us the Beatitudes, right? And I think he does that and kind of exemplifies what he is looking for on a day to day basis through the words of Jesus. I think Jesus wants his people to, first and foremost, be reliant only on him. I think he wants us to be humble, to be merciful, to be pure in heart and peacemakers, and also to be bold in our faith. And I think that the rest of the Sermon on the Mount after the Beatitudes really does a good job of explaining, diving deeper, and manifesting what those calls to action really look like in the Christian life. I also think it's important to note that Jesus makes it very clear before he continues his sermon that he is not here to abolish the law, aka the Ten Commandments or the writings of the Old Testament prophets, but rather to accomplish their purpose and provide clarity into how to obey and interpret the law. As we move through the sermon, I find it really encouraging that Jesus isn't demanding strict legalistic procedures from his followers, but rather attempting to address the main issue at this time with the people he is ministering to, their hearts. Before any of the things that Jesus lays out can be effective or honor God, I think our hearts must first be in the right spot, fully focused on Jesus with the intent of serving others with love, compassion, and mercy. All right, so the first teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is a warning against anger. And in this teaching, Jesus asks us to avoid things like cursing others and holding anger and resentment in our hearts, as well as to reconcile our differences with those that have offended us, or maybe reconcile with others that we may have offended. And I think this first teaching really strikes me. As someone who dealt with a lot of bitterness and anger issues in the past, I know firsthand what it can be like to live in anger. Several years ago, I read a book called The Bait of Satan by John Bevere, and it's all about letting go of offense and hatred in our hearts. And I don't think I realized at the time just how much anger I'd been holding on to my whole life. And in the midst of reading that book, with the help of my friends and family, I was thankfully able to be freed from that bondage of hatred that had been shackling down my life for so long. I think anger is like drinking a poison and expecting your enemy to die from it. And so I just encourage you today to reach out to your support system, pray, and absolutely seek Jesus if you are struggling with letting go of hurt or anger in your lives. And I hope that you're able to be freed from that through that process. Moving on from anger, Jesus then warns us about lust, adultery, and divorce. And before I go any further into this one, I just want to make a couple of things clear. One, this is in no way a judgment against anyone's character or life experiences. Jesus knows our hearts and what we have been through, and it is through him that we can all be saved, forgiven, and redeemed. And I pray that that is the case for anyone listening in this segment. And two, life is messy, right? Life is messy and people lie and they hurt and abuse others and take advantage of them. And if you are a victim of those things or have been a victim of those things, know that Jesus wants you to come to him today and allow him to work in you and restore you from those things. Ephesians 5:12 says it is shameful to even mention what the disobedient do in secret. And so I don't want to touch on this for too long or make this a platform to attack or call anyone out. But I hope that if you have gone through this, that you know that I am praying for you, that there are support groups that can help you move through that abuse and offense. And I hope that God works in your life to free you from that trauma today. I think what Jesus is really emphasizing here is to love and honor our spouses and remove any obstacles in our lives that may tempt us or lead us into dishonoring them. I think marriage is a sacred covenant, and I think that we must do whatever it takes to honor that covenant. And that sometimes means giving up things we otherwise value in order to honor God and our spouses through the covenant of marriage. I think Jesus meant this warning for everyone, but I also have to imagine that during this teaching, Jesus may have been addressing mostly men, because I think it is men that deal with lust and infidelity much more than women. And that isn't to say that women don't struggle with this topic, but I think historically this has been a cause for a lot of failed marriages due to the failings of the men in those marriages not honoring this warning. But like everything, right, God is good and Jesus is abundant in mercy and grace. And so if this is something that is affecting your life, again, I sincerely hope and pray that God will work through your marriage, will work through um, whatever situation you're in and redeem you and anyone that's involved with that, and ultimately lead you to a place where you can glorify God more through that healing and through that redemption. Next, Jesus addresses the idea of making vows. And I think that this is something that I in the past have been really bad about. Saying things like, I promise this or I swear that. And I think that Jesus in this teaching really just wants his followers to live by their word, right? Let your yes be yes and your no be no, and not be beholden to anything else but that. I think in today's world that we make vows or promises to try and cover up maybe insecurities or to overcompensate for what we offer others. And I think that that can be deadly territory to live in. I think what Jesus is asking his followers to do here is simply live honestly, not to take on more than we can accomplish, and to establish healthy boundaries in our lives with our words and actions so that we do not shame ourselves or others. We should be okay with telling others no when we need to, and for taking care of ourselves, as well as establishing healthy boundaries in all of our relationships so we don't feel the need to make empty promises. Next up, we have revenge. And I think that this can tie back into the anger problem by trying to justify our harm against others based on the harm or perceived harm others may have done against us. And this one is a teaching that I think really probably stirred up the crowd because Jesus doesn't simply tell us to not seek revenge against others, but in fact to do the opposite and overwhelm those who offend or harm us with radical love. Jesus in this teaching mentions that if someone sues us and takes our shirt, that we should also give them our jacket. I believe that during this time, it was maybe Jewish law that someone could not take another person's only coat in a lawsuit or dispute because that coat was also used as a blanket at night as well to keep them warm. However, I think that there were probably people at this time that were maybe more vicious and cunning to those people, and they could instead demand the other party's shirt as payment, leaving them essentially naked or vulnerable with only that jacket to cover them. But by giving the offended party both our jacket and our coat, whether metaphorically or literally, I think Jesus is teaching us to expose the injustice of those that would persecute or oppress us through costly generosity, which in turn may soften the heart of the offended party, show them the errors of their viciousness, and hopefully bring them to reconcile peacefully with the other party. I think this teaching honestly kind of blows my mind. But I do think that it is so important for us all to try and pursue generosity and peace more than our own diluted, selfish sense of justice, especially in a time fueled by outrage culture. Relationships with people are hard, but I think that by being agents of peace, we can bridge the gaps we have between ourselves, others, and Jesus much more effectively. This talk also kind of segues into Jesus' next topic, which is loving our enemies. I think the reality is that until we are saved, we are all enemies of God, and the consequences of that are unimaginable. And as much as it might sting, we all deserve hell, but through Jesus and Jesus alone, we can be saved. Grace is not earned, but rather it is given. And so it is our duty to extend that grace to everyone, just as Jesus does, including and especially those that reject or persecute us. By praying for and loving our enemies, we can again try and mend relationships with one another and hopefully show Jesus' love to others so that they too may seek him out. After Jesus addresses offense and conflict, he then turns to caring for the needy. This teaching is pretty plain and simple. Take care of those that are less fortunate than you. Jesus is asking us to acknowledge and show gratitude for the blessings we receive, and to honor God and those blessings by being good stewards of those blessings, and in turn, blessing others through them. This idea is seen a lot throughout the ministry of Jesus. His heart for the poor, outcasts, and the least of us is very apparent, and how he wants his followers to treat them is very, very clear. I think that this is a practice that everyone does differently and personally, so I encourage you to make sure your heart is in the right place when serving others, and to not make it performative, but rather to make it a frequent practice in your life, used to glorify God and all he has done in your life. I think this teaching, along with the next two, which cover prayer and fasting, were specifically targeting the Pharisees and Sadducees, who were the religious leaders and interpreters of the law at this time, to call out the hypocrisy they displayed in their lives. Jesus has several run-ins with the religious leaders in the towns he is teaching in, and in one exchange delivers the woes and sorrows to the Pharisees for living hypocritical, hollow faith lives. When it comes to prayer and fasting, Jesus wants us to make these practices personal and simple. Prayer should come from the heart and be done with gratitude and humility, and fasting should be done to remind us of our need for the Lord and to remind us of the faithfulness of the Lord. These practices are not meant for us to display or seek favor from people, but rather to be done in private, with a true and honest heart focused on God. We should be praying for forgiveness as well as forgiving others. I know that I personally used to struggle with prayer because I wasn't sure I was doing it right or didn't want to mess it up. But God knows our hearts, and Jesus asks us to pray to help grow in our relationship with him, not to make fancy speeches. If this is something you also struggle with, I found that structuring my prayer helps me find the words I'm looking for. I start first with praising God for everything he has done in your life, then coming to God with your requests or concerns, and then finishing your prayer with thanksgiving, thanking Jesus for our salvation. Keep it simple, keep it personal, and keep it constant in your daily life. And I think you'll begin to see God moving more and more. After Jesus addresses prayer and fasting, he then turns to something everyone can identify with: money. Jesus again does not mess around in what he tells his audience. You cannot serve two masters. Do not prioritize earthly wealth over heavenly riches. I think that money is probably the easiest thing for us to idolize, because in a lot of ways it symbolizes safety, security, and status for us. And while having money is not inherently bad, when we choose to prioritize its pursuit over the pursuit of Jesus, we are making a statement of what we really do serve. I've found that giving generously, thanking God for his care and provision, and acknowledging that everything I do have is only because of God's will and not by my own doing, that my relationship with money has become much more harmonious and purpose-driven. I pray that we can all let go of the fear of lack and instead turn our faith towards Jesus to provide everything that we may need. Near the end of his sermon, Jesus reminds us of the importance of not judging others. Remember, the measure by which you judge, you will be judged. I think that this is a further emphasis on the idea that we need to be overwhelmingly gracious with people. If you are feeling really judgmental, It might be time to take a self inventory of your heart and to evaluate why you are feeling that way and to give up those feelings to God. Jesus also reminds us of the golden rule: do to others what you would like done to you. Jesus reminds his audience that his heart for his people is in relationship with him and one another, and it cannot be overstated. Take care of people, be gracious and loving, and you will reap what you sow. Jesus also gives an image of the narrow gate, a warning that the kingdom of heaven will not be inherited by all, but only those who have faith in Jesus and live by his teachings. This is a stern reminder to take what Jesus has taught on the Sermon on the Mount and to try and adhere to it as much as possible. And when we stumble, to seek reconciliation and forgiveness, which is given freely through Jesus. While there were certainly many people who heard this sermon that didn't believe in Jesus at the time, Jesus also addresses his followers and disciples. Jesus tells those that follow him of the tree that produces good fruit versus the tree that produces no fruit. This parable serves as a warning against false teachers, those that speak about believing in Jesus but have no proof of it in their lives, and emphasizes the importance of faithful obedience. While it is true that salvation comes from faith in Jesus alone, I believe that Jesus is telling his followers that true faith produces faithful actions, which result in bearing good fruit. After the sermon, Jesus implores those that listened to build their lives, their foundation, on his teachings, so that they may endure whatever comes their way, just as we should. I want to wrap things up by simply asking, what does the proof of your faith look like in your life? I hope that you can reflect on that question with joy in your heart and be encouraged by what God is doing through you in your daily life. I pray that the Holy Spirit would speak to each of us today and give us an opportunity to step out in faith and live out the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. Loving Jesus is shown by loving others, and I hope you are encouraged and empowered to do that radically today. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord turn his face toward you all and give you all peace. Thanks for listening. See you next time.